Jalen Wagner. It is without doubt that the wooden instrument has sparked interest for centuries. We have gone a long way in introducing these instruments to participants and getting them to play. But the history of these instruments have gone unnoticed. So, one of these instruments is the violin. The violin is more than just a wood-shaped sound-making box. It has a whole history that we tend to forget about. The sound of the violin is a way of communication, and without truly understanding the history of the violin, we can't really understand the communication in the atmosphere that the violin wants to create. Through my extensive research and my playing for 8 years, I have learned a lot about the making of violins. Today, we are going to talk about how the violin is made, the development of the violin and the famous composers that came with that, and the famous players of today and how they have introduced the rise in popularity of the violin. First, we're going to talk about how the violin is made. I have with me a violin. Along with it is the bow of the violin. To make the violin, according to Gerald Seaman, the violin was constructed as early as the 19th century in China and Persia. It has grown and perfected in majorly since. According to the case of Antonio Stradivari, the first reputable violin was constructed in 1718 by Antonio Stradivari. Stradivari was considered a master in his work and finally perfected the violin, which was considered a mature example of the master's golden age period. But how did he do this? Well, Antonio Stradivari took a piece of wood and carved it with a tool named a gouge. He carved out the back and the front, along with the F-holes that produce and allow the sound to come out. Next, he gave it a neck, a peg box, the pegs, the bridge, the tailpiece, and the chin rest. These are all made out of wood. The strings are strung from the pegs all the way around across the bridge and through the tailpiece. The strings are then played with a bow, which is also wood, strung by real horsehair, and rubbed with rosin, which is just tree sap. According to Gerald Seaman, in his article, The Violin, the carved out belly of the violin transmits the sounds of the 4 strings that stretch across its wooden neck and bridge. Now that we have discussed how the violin arose and was crafted, let's talk about the development that led to the famous composers and their pieces. The violin was not always considered a solo instrument. It was also considered an instrument. It was considered an instrument that was made for accompaniment to human voice, or also ensemble pieces. Isabella Wagner states in her article, "A Short History of the Violin Virtuoso Profession," the violin was made for the accompaniment of human voice. During the period of development of Baroque music, the violin was then used as a part in an ensemble. However, as the violin developed itself, composers saw the potential of the violin and wrote pieces strictly for the violin. These were like Bach, Corelli, and Vivaldi. They made pieces like the Double Violin Concerto in D minor, the Concerto in D major, and Four Seasons. And a piece would sometimes look like this, made for the violin. Some creators made pieces specifically for the violin, like Niccolo Paganini. He was a violinist in 1700 who transformed the way the violin was played. According to Classic FM, Paganini's skills on the violin were unparalleled. He was the first solo violinist to perform publicly without sheet music, choosing to memorize everything. He also did techniques such as spiccato, which is like the bouncing of the bow, left-hand pizzicato, and harmonics. Now that we have established the development of the violin that led to famous composers and pieces, let's talk about the players of today and the violin's popularity. As the development of the violin has been perfected, there have been violinists who take playing to a whole new level. Itzhak Perlman was a violinist who started at the age of 3 and totally changed the idea of what the violin can play. According to Isabella Wagner, A Short History of the Violin Virtuoso, his teacher was Ivan Galamini. Itzhak Perl introduced jazz, folklore, ragtime, and several others onto the violin and really gained popularity into that area. Hilary Hahn was a 3-time Grammy Award-winning violinist who introduced the violin to the younger generation through social media. David Allen wrote an article about this, stating that Hilary Hahn used the hashtag 100 days of practice to make a statement about the need for musicians to accept imperfections and embrace the vulnerabilities of a challenge, and to challenge the toxic mentality around practices. In conclusion, we talked about the way the violin is crafted, the development of the violin, which led to famous composers and pieces, the popular violinists today that have contributed to the violin's rise in popularity. The violin is more than just a wood-shaped sound-making box. It has a whole history that we tend to forget about. It's often looked at as just a wooden instrument, but the violin is truly more than that. Starting as a block of wood, the violin is formed as a vessel of communication through sound and song. If you can't appreciate the way the violin came about, there's simply no way you can appreciate the pure emotion and atmosphere the violin creates.